Thank you, Elizabeth, and kind of interesting to see some of those old photos. And thank you to the Southern Center for Human Rights for honoring me with the Douglas Award. I want to acknowledge all the work that is done by the Southern Center. I know one of the things that was alluded to earlier is that sometimes victories seem few and far between, and when they come, we want to celebrate them. And I also know that what defeat looks like oftentimes ends up being a body in a casket that inevitably rips apart everyone who gets involved in this crazy machinery of death penalty injustice in our country. And I just want to say to each and every person who works day in and day out to save human lives, how grateful I am and what heroes you all are. I also want to acknowledge my two sisters and my daughter, Elizabeth. Elizabeth Zitrin talked about our father being murdered in front of my mother 30 years ago. And in a kind of hauntingly similar crime, 8 years ago, our brother-in-law, Stephen, was murdered in our home. And one of the things that we try to do is be cognizant of the fact that in the aftermath of violence, healing's an ongoing process for everyone. And one of the ways that I believe that we help heal from the wounds of murder is to not replicate the act of taking lives of another human being. There's a paradigm in our society that presumes that all family members of murder victims want the death penalty, that they need it in order to find some kind of closure or get better from that awful pain. And as a consequence, our elected officials run some kind of moral obligation to provide an execution solution to victims' pain. And I see that play out all the time. I first became aware of it a few days after my father's killer was arrested, when I ran into an old family friend in the grocery store, and he says to me, "Hey, Renny, I hope they fry the bastard. I hope they fry the person who killed my dad." And I didn't know how to respond to him. I couldn't really respond to him because I sensed that his offer that he hoped for an execution was intended to be some kind of a bomb. It was an act of empathy in his own mind, perhaps. But what really bothered me as I thought about it is that he's someone who'd known me my whole life. And he knew that prior to my dad's murder, I had opposed the death penalty. But because of that paradigm, he had presumed that because my father had been murdered, I would change my position on the death penalty. And reflecting on that, I realized that if that took place, if I changed my position on capital punishment because my father was murdered, that would only really compound the crime. Because not only would my father be taken away from me, but so too would my values. And it's the same for individuals and society. If we let those who kill turn us into killers, then it's that evil that triumphs, and we're all the worse for it. And so, in a way, as a survivor or homicide victim, opposition to the death penalty is a way that I honor the loss. And those of us throughout the country, throughout the world, who have had that experience of the unthinkable happen, muddling through it, coming to conclude that filling another coffin doesn't do anything except widen the circle of pain. And we stand in opposition and expose the fallacy of the paradigm that all family members want the death penalty. I see it in my personal life. I also remember seeing it one time. It struck home in policy in Georgia, because I made a pilgrimage once there to the mothership on Poplar Street 18 years ago, when a man named Fred Gilraith was set for execution. Fred Gilraith had killed his wife and his stepfather, and left an 11-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son without a mother and subsequently without a father because he went to prison and was sentenced to death row. And as the state of Georgia was fixing to carry out the execution, the children of the murder victim family, the children of the killer, wanted to speak in opposition to that. They didn't want to see that carried out. And I went to Georgia as a family member of murder victims to speak, because the promise that was made to the victims community that you would be treated by dignity and respect, that you would have people who would advocate your position, was betrayed when it came to people who had family members who opposed the death penalty. And I watched, almost in disbelief, as this son and this daughter of a murder victim family pleaded with the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles, pleaded to stop the cycle of violence, to not kill their father. And I stood that afternoon after it was turned down and watched them plead with the grandchildren of this murder victim and the grandchildren of this person who was put to death, and watched as the state of Georgia made orphans out of children, of the offspring. And that's something I carry with me. It's that paradigm, because the Board of Pardons and Paroles could not see how a family member of a murder victim would want to oppose the death penalty. They couldn't break through that paradigm. I'm lucky this year that the struggle in the state of New Hampshire is kind of symptomatic and symbolic of the struggle that we have throughout this country to put an end to capital punishment. It was 21 years ago that I introduced the first legislation to repeal capital punishment in the state of New Hampshire. The reason we're having the debate, in many ways, grew out of a horrible murder in Massachusetts, where Massachusetts almost became the 39th state to reinstate the death penalty in the aftermath of a murder of Jeffrey Curley, who was a young boy who was lured by pedophiles and killed and had his body defiled in the state of New Hampshire. And his father led a campaign to reinstitute the death penalty in Massachusetts that was successful, to the point where both houses had passed a bill, but for one courageous legislator who changed his mind, John Slattery, the bill ended up being a tie vote and it failed. That was the low water mark of the death penalty in this country. And subsequent to that time, a number of things have happened, I think, that have brought us to the place where, in recent years, we're seeing the death penalty on the way out. But I want to just tell you that what happened this year in New Hampshire, when we overrode the governor's veto, was a culmination of a struggle that was really initiated in June of 1834, when Governor William Badger asked the New Hampshire legislature to repeal capital punishment. I was thinking, Frederick Douglass was 16 years old and still enslaved when New Hampshire first began to deal with the death penalty. And a lot of things have taken place in the 9 generations that have passed, and a lot of changes were instituted. But what I'm really cognizant of is the need, day in and day out, to do every little thing there is. I want to ask this crowd, anybody who's ever come to New Hampshire and helped us out, to please raise your hand. And keep the hands up. Keep your hands up. I want to know anybody. I want everybody who's ever represented an individual or worked to prevent an individual from being subject to the death penalty in this room. Please raise your hand. I would, and keep your hands up, and I would like to know everyone who has ever contributed to, has ever walked a picket line in opposition to the death penalty, or has ever made a contribution to any crusading organization that has fought against the death penalty. Please raise your hand. So as I look around the room and I see all these hands up, I want to say thank you to each and every one of you, because when you override a veto by one vote, after 185 years, You're able to do so because everything that we do and everything we did matters. And I want to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of New Hampshire for your help in putting an end to the capital punishment in our state and to making it possible for me to stand before you and say that New Hampshire and the nation can live without the death penalty. Thank you for your work.